I want to talk about the leadership struggle in the House for majority leader, and specifically the candidacy of Kevin McCarthy. Now, Kevin McCarthy, as you know, was the minority leader for the Republicans prior to the GOP taking the House. And in about 3 weeks, the House is going to have a very interesting question of whether he is made the House Speaker. Now, obviously, this is a Republican call. The Republicans have the majority by, 7 or 8 seats, something like that. And so they get to pick the Speaker. But here is where the problem begins. Now, I was doing my Locals Q&A yesterday. By the way, I do a weekly Q&A on Locals. And if you want to be able to interact with me directly, this is a great way to sign on. If you become a local subscriber or an annual subscriber, you get all these free movies. But in addition, I do a weekly half hour. Debbie actually made a cameo appearance yesterday. It was really fun. In any event, we're talking about Kevin McCarthy, and somebody asked, Dinesh, if it were up to you, who would you name as House Speaker? And I go, look, we in an ideal world, if I were king of the world and I was picking a speaker, I probably would pick somebody like Matt Gaetz, because I think he's a fighter, and it would be a whole different house under Matt Gaetz. But I also realize that by and large, this is a decision that is made. You need to have somebody who can appeal to the different factions of the GOP, someone who's sufficiently establishment, can also appeal to the moderates in the party, but ideally represents, if you will, the MAGA wing of the party. Now, Kevin McCarthy says, I will do those things. But of course, it's the credibility of that affirmation that is open to question. Now, there are a handful, and it's only a handful, I think only 5 Republicans who have said basically hard no on McCarthy. We're not voting for this guy. And that group includes Matt Gaetz, but it includes also Andy Biggs. It includes Representative Bob Good of Virginia. It includes Matt Rosendale of Montana and Ralph Norman of South Carolina. This is sort of the hardcore anti-McCarthy. Now, this itself is a big problem because the Republicans don't have a big majority. And moreover, there are other Republicans who agree with these guys. In fact, there are 20 House Republicans, by and large Republicans on the right edge of the party. And they've basically said, look, we're not for McCarthy unless we get some very specific guarantees out of McCarthy. And while McCarthy has been meeting with these guys and giving them generic assurances, it's not clear that these 20 Republicans, and this would be far more than enough to sink McCarthy's candidacy. So typically, if you don't get a majority, it goes to the second ballot and third ballot and the fourth ballot. But the interesting question is, what happens if you go to 3 and 4 ballots and McCarthy just doesn't have the votes? Now, this is when things get really interesting because, of course, a rival candidate could emerge. Right now, there does not appear to be a rival candidate who's close to getting the required, 218 votes, I guess it is, to be able to displace McCarthy. And I think what's really going for the McCarthy faction, the McCarthy people, is that, hey, listen, you can't fight something with nothing. So you might grumble about McCarthy, but he's sort of all we got. You got to shrug your shoulders and go with him. Now, the Democrats have been making some very interesting noises, specifically the one Democrat. This is Ro Khanna of California. By the way, this is the only guy who seems to care about free speech in the Democratic Party. If you look at some of the revelations on the Twitter files, you see that this is the one guy that from time to time goes, wait a minute, don't people have the right to speak and say whatever they want? And isn't it wrong for the government to be intruding and telling them what they can and can't say? So there's one half-decent Democrat on this issue. Well, apparently Ro Khanna has intimated or suggested that if Kevin McCarthy can't get the votes and if the Republicans can't agree on a speaker, there might be a few Democrats who might be willing to come into this and cut a deal either with McCarthy or maybe even with someone else. Now, the problem with this is that if Democrats are involved, they're going to have their own conditions. Here's Ro Khanna talking to The Hill. He goes, this would require some shared subpoena power. Whoa. Some commitment to legislating, meaning Democratic bills making their way through the House. And it would have to be the right candidate. So I don't think the Republicans are going to be on board with any of this. They don't want to give up their unilateral subpoena power. Nancy Pelosi never did. She never gave Republicans a share in governance. Why would Republicans do that now? So this is why I think Marjorie Taylor Greene has endorsed Kevin McCarthy, not merely to increase her influence with McCarthy, but also because she believes that, listen, McCarthy is the best we have, and we don't want to take the risk of McCarthy's candidacy going down, and then a more moderate or more liberal Republican gets picked. Why? Because a handful of Democrats jump in. I mean, I think, quite frankly, if a handful of Democrats jumped in with their own candidate, that candidate would be toxic and completely lose support in the Republican Party. But none of this, by the way, has happened in 100 years. So the idea that we could have a guy come forward for House majority, for Speaker, not get the votes first, second, third, and fourth time, things go now into kind of an open field of candidates. This would be all very interesting. Obviously, our goal is to have a real fighter and a real leader in the House, but there are some pitfalls. And so whenever I'm asked a question, what would you like to see? I always say, in the ideal world, I like X. But sometimes in the real world, we have to settle for the best we can get. Some would call that the lesser evil. But nevertheless, the best option that is practical is the option that in the end I have to go for.